Human groups are made of human systems, and those systems fail in predictable ways, sometimes with horrible results. But those failures can be identified, understood, and corrected. They can even be predicted, or maybe prevented. This has changed the game. Welcome to Change the Game's first episode of Season 2. I'm Kip Perez, obviously. Today's guest is Stephen Neff. He's a retired assistant U.S. attorney with 30 years experience, so he's been doing this for a hot minute, as both a military and federal prosecutor. His cases included murder, terrorism, public corruption, human trafficking, organized crime. He has done it all. He also served overseas as the DOJ's resident legal advisor at the U.S. Embassy in Georgia, the country, not the U.S. state, where he advised the U.S. ambassador, and he helped introduce jury trials into their legal system, which I think is super fascinating. And now he leads his own consulting group called Neff Strategies, and he provides training and investigative support to law enforcement agencies, legal professionals, other organizations. So today I want to examine the territory, I guess, between suspicion and proof. How does an investigator evaluate credibility? How do you resist confirmation bias? How do you recognize corruption? And when you think about it, everyone in your line of work, everybody who's telling you a story has a vested interest in the outcome. So first off, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Kid. I'm really happy to be here.
So I've been watching your Substack for a while, and I love the sample closing argument that you put up for the Lindsay Clancy case. Obviously, you're not prosecuting it. I just want to throw that out there. But seeing that was a pretty fascinating exercise. What prompted you to do that?
Well, honestly, I'd seen a lot of discussion about the case, and candidly, I hadn't been following it really at all. I was aware of it, but I wasn't, watching it. But a lot of people were commenting on it, lawyers in particular, on LinkedIn, and most of the commentary was about the defense lawyer, who, by all accounts, is doing a fantastic job. Um, and so I thought to myself, well, I have my company now. Part of my company is dedicated to training lawyers on trial advocacy issues and doing trial consultancy work for lawyers. So just as kind of a sample for my business, I thought, why don't I do a sort of a mock closing argument from the prosecution side? Because nobody's really talking about the prosecutors that much. They're just all talking about the defense lawyer, and give I guess, that side of it, and that people maybe aren't hearing as much in the social media sphere. So what I did was I went and I kind of researched for a couple of hours the evidence that had been introduced in the trial and curated it from a prosecutorial standpoint and created a game plan for a closing argument and then an outline for a closing argument. And then I just went downstairs to my basement. That's why I call it the back porch and basement closing argument, and gave sort of that sample argument so people could see how they're structured, how prosecutors go about the business of persuasion and advocacy. And, I was hoping that lawyers out there would see it and say, hey, I'd like to have that guy maybe come help me with my trial. So that was
Nice.
that was sort of the impetus behind it. And I originally actually posted it on LinkedIn, and I thought, well, people on Substack might find it's interesting too. So I did it there as well.
No, I think it was incredibly fascinating because it is a compelling story. But talk to me from a prosecutor position. What separates that compelling accusation from an actual provable case?
Well, obviously every case starts with an accusation of some kind. Something happens and somebody reports it, and police and prosecutors are involved in going and figuring it out. It's kind of everything's kind of like a puzzle, right? It's all just there's a bunch of pieces around, and you kind of got to work together to put them together. I think one of my favorite parts about being a prosecutor was working with law enforcement agents in trying to put the puzzle together. And of course, I think it's important to go into every case without any preconceived notions. And you've received a report of something or you have evidence of something, and you just follow the evidence. And And so one of the things I tell prosecutors when I train them is that it's very important to layer your proof. As prosecutors, everybody knows, of course, that we have to prove our cases beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's a little bit more granular than that because depending on the number of charges you have, every charge has elements to the charge that must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So, for example, if I charge somebody with being a felon in possession of a firearm, which is a violation of federal criminal law, I have four things that I have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. I have to prove that the person actually possessed the firearm, that the firearm had somehow affected interstate commerce, that the person who possessed the firearm at the time he possessed it was a convicted felon, and fourth, that he knew that he was a convicted felon at the time he possessed the gun. So those are the elements that I have to work with. And those are the elements that I have to prove, every one of them beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not good enough if I prove three elements to 100-degree certainty and the fourth element I can only prove to a 75% certainty. Then I lose. That's not beyond a reasonable doubt. I didn't prove every element. So when you go about prosecuting a case, what you want to do is layer your proof as to each one of those elements. And by that, I mean have multiple sources of solid evidence and solid proof that you can present as to each element. So you're not just relying on one thing one person said, or one piece of evidence, or one document, or whatever it is. And so when you take that approach, you're gathering information and evidence that will either corroborate what your understanding is and corroborate what witnesses have said, victims have said, suspects have said, or refute it. And, then you can be confident that you have a strong case. And so as prosecutors, we have an ethical duty to only prosecute those people who we actually have a personal belief in their guilt. And we also have a belief that we have a sufficient amount of proof to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That doesn't always mean that, it ends up happening that way, but those two things are prerequisites before you go into any prosecution.
So you've never prosecuted someone that you deep down wondered if they were innocent.
No, no.
Okay.
I mean, I've dismissed cases as I've learned evidence that ended up sort of subverting what I originally thought. Or I've been on the road to prosecuting them and then said, "Oh, wait, no, I'm not convinced. I don't think either I don't have enough evidence to pursue it, or I have some doubts now whether the person is guilty." So if I have any doubts about now, that doesn't mean, by the way, Kit, that everybody that I've prosecuted and has been convicted has been actually guilty. I think they have, but I could be wrong. I mean, I'm human. I'm a human being. We all are, and we make mistakes. But one of the great things about our system is that it's designed through the process as much as we possibly can as fallen human beings to protect those people who are actually innocent. So, I've had juries come back and find people not guilty that I'm still convinced were guilty. Um, but, if I myself had any doubt along the way, I would have stopped the process and reversed it.
Okay. So you don't think, to the best of your knowledge, that you've ever convicted anyone innocent, not that you'd openly say, well, there's this one guy.
No, I don't think I have. But I also, if somebody came to me and said, "Hey, we now have proof that this person was innocent," I'm not going to be shocked because I'm not perfect. None of us are. We just do the best we can with the information that we have at our disposal. And, I mean, I think as technology advances and as our ability to examine evidence and collect evidence and glean information from evidence becomes more advanced, hopefully, we'll keep reducing the amount of innocent people that go to prison based just on witness testimony. And I think, we've seen that quite a bit in things like the advance of DNA and the ability to go back and look and say, "Hey, wait a minute, this person actually did not rape this woman. It was somebody else, that his DNA was not present." But at the time, the prosecutors do the best they can, and they have witnesses that say what happened and identify this person, and so you pursue it based on the evidence you have. I'm sure they believed in the defendant's guilt at the time, and I'm sure they believed they had sufficient proof to prove it at the time. Obviously they did, or else they wouldn't have convicted him, probably. So, I mean, it's there. There's no such thing as a perfect system. If there were, I'd join it and ruin it.
I've heard that applied to churches, actually. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned a couple minutes ago that you have to layer your evidence, right? You can't just rely on one thing that one person said. But how does memory contamination or trauma or loyalty or self-interest, like what do you do when you have a witness and they're, I guess, broadly truthful, but maybe they get a very specific detail wrong? What do you do with that?
Well, if I know that they get the detail wrong, and they're a witness in the case, then I talk about it with them. I'll show them, hey, we have something that suggests that maybe that's not accurate. Um, you know, Somebody could say, yeah, the car was red, and we have video that says the car was blue, actually. So so, I mean, obviously a lot depends on how material that fact is. A lot depends on whether the person is mistaken or if they're trying to be dishonest. And anytime I have a witness who contradicts some other piece of proof that I have, one of my responsibilities as a prosecutor is to actually disclose that to the defense. So, if I'm talking to a witness and they say, oh, yeah, the car was red, and we know from the video the car was blue, I'll tell the defense, hey, when I talk to my witness, the witness says the car was red. And some of them, I mean, I don't try to correct them. I want them to testify based on their memory. And then I just have to decide as a prosecutor, does that matter to me? If this witness gets up and gets the color of the car wrong, how is that going to affect my case? Do I even want to call him in the first place? How important is he to the case? Is he telling the truth otherwise and he just, misremembers something? Or is he trying to do something in particular that um, furthers a goal of his, or what he thinks is a goal of mine, or whatnot? So there's a lot of that evaluation that I think has to go into those situations.
So you actually have, I guess, what you'd call a red team process where you're arguing against yourself, you're trying to disprove your own case in preparation.
Yeah, in fact, I tell prosecutors all the time, when you get a case, the first thing you should do is approach it from the defense side. Make the best case you can for the defense. And in that way, you're better able to analyze your own case. You find the weaknesses in your own case. You find the weaknesses in your witness or in your documentary evidence or in your video or audio or lack thereof. All those things matter. And of course, I think it was Sun Tzu that said, know your enemy and be able to speak his language. And so I think that applies pretty well to trial work. If you're only looking at your own case through rose-colored glasses, then you're going to have a problem. And I had a colleague in my office, a very good friend of mine, who used to say, I never fall in love with my own case. And he's right. You don't want to fall in love with your own case. You always want to be skeptical. You always want to try to find the weaknesses. And you always want to think about, how is the defense going to attack this case if I were the defense lawyer? And, almost, I would say every case, there is an angle. There is something that the defense can argue. Maybe it's a mitigation issue or a matter of degree issue or what have you. For example, the government has charged my client with selling 20 kilos of methamphetamine, but he only sold, you know, 2 ounces. So, there's always probably some take that the defense can have based on the evidence or lack thereof, that it's important as a prosecutor, as a trial lawyer in general, to know.
So you're talking about two concepts. You're kind of going around them. So I'll just name them. One is orienting to reality. You have to have a very firm grasp on reality as it is and not how you wish it to be.
Hmm.
But you also have to have the capacity for healthy embarrassment for yourself. You have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to be embarrassed if the evidence says, hey, you're way off. You have to be able to shift that.
Yeah, that's 100%. I think as I alluded to earlier, that's an ethical requirement, actually. If we have it wrong, we need to be able to stand up and say we got it wrong. And if we have evidence that undermines one of our own witnesses or undermines our case in general, we have not just an ethical obligation, a legal obligation, but a moral one to notify the defense. And if it's bad enough, dismiss the case or, not pursue that particular charge or what have you. So, there's definitely those two aspects of it. And I've had moments where I have been embarrassed before. I thought I knew what was going on, and it turned out I didn't. So, I mean, I think that happens to all of us. It's just that the stakes are awfully high, right? When you're talking about somebody's liberty, the stakes become very high. And when you're talking about somebody who has the power of a prosecutor, it's even more important that the people occupying those positions have that kind of integrity because we rely on that in our system. It would be easy to bury things if you wanted to bury things. And certainly there's plenty of examples where prosecutors have done that very thing. I don't think it's quite as common as maybe some people or maybe some defense lawyers would like to make you think, but it definitely does happen. So, that goes back to your hiring process. It's not just about hiring a good lawyer. It's, are you hiring somebody who's ethical and has integrity? That's non-negotiable.
So let's talk about your vetting process. And I'm sure there's elements of it that you would use with witnesses, but also use when hiring a junior prosecutor or something like that. Talk to me about what it is you're looking for. It's easy to say, I want somebody who's ethical. How do you tell?
Well, obviously, in a very broad sense, is do your actions match your words? And it's easy to put something on a resume. It's easy to say certain things, but does your conduct follow that up? So I guess in the context of hiring, you need to fully vet them. You need to go back and talk to people that they've worked with and talk to people that not just supervisors, but also subordinates at other places or peers, people who worked with them much more closely. You want to find out if all of these high-minded ideals that they're putting down on a piece of paper match the way they conducted themselves in real life. So it's kind of like an investigation in and of itself. And then with witnesses, you're testing what they say based on what the rest of the proof is. And, sometimes what they say doesn't match your understanding of the rest of the proof. So have to try to work out those differences. Again, is this somebody that's just, misremembering? Do I have something wrong? Or is there something more insidious going on? Are they lying to me while putting up this sort of helpful front? So I can tell you an example of a time when I was very publicly embarrassed by um, by a witness that I'd spent probably 8 sessions and a couple of years worth of time worth of prepping for trial, if you want me to tell that story.
Oh, I'm all ears. Let's hear it.
Okay. So in 2008, I was the chief prosecutor on a federal capital case. It was the first death penalty case in the history of the Eastern District of Tennessee, that federal district. And it involved three defendants who had been systematically robbing and burglarizing a restaurant owner from Atlanta. And they would go to his house, they would burglarize his house, they would rob him. They actually went and ate in his restaurant. He didn't realize that's who it was, but they did all sorts of things to him. They picked him out as an easy mark. And one day he, they decided that they were going to kill him. And so they went to his house. They kidnapped him, threw him in his own restaurant van in the back of his van. Two of them did. The one who was going to trial was the driver, the one who was the witness I'm going to talk about in a second, was in the car holding him at gunpoint. And then the third defendant was driving a follow-on car. So they drove from Atlanta to Chattanooga, where they shot him in the mouth several times and left him on the side of the road to die. And so, as we investigated the case and we identified the suspects, and then we made the case, and then we charged the case, we charged all three of them with the same thing. And the United States Attorney General at the time told us to seek the death penalty. So, two of them, however, pleaded guilty, and they pleaded guilty to mandatory life sentences and agreed to cooperate. And the one who had been driving the car, the one who fired the killing shots, the one who was the mastermind of all of it, he was the one that was going to trial. And so, in the months leading up to the trial, my colleague and I, uh, he got one of the cooperating defendants as a witness, and I got the other one. We just sort of randomly chose it, I guess. And so in the months leading up to the trial, I was working on prepping my witness, prepping that cooperating defendant who had confessed and told the story of what happened. It wasn't accurate in all respects, but it wasn't anything that did violence to the truth. Um, and so we decided we were going to go ahead and use him. And so the day of the trial, and the day that he was the day of trial that he was supposed to testify, the FBI case agent went back to him before he took the stand and told him he was about to go on and asked him if he was ready. And he said to the agent, he said, "Oh yeah, I'm ready to go out there and tell the truth." And so he got up on the stand, and I started asking him the sort of the preliminary questions that I ask all cooperating defendants. Who are you? Where are you from? Where do you live? Well, at the time he lived in the jail, in the Hamilton County Jail. And I said, "How long have you been there?" He's like, 2 years, whatever it was. And I said, "Why are you living in the Hamilton County Jail?" And he said, "Because I pled guilty to murder." And, so I said, "Did you reach an agreement with the United States about your testimony here?" "Yes, I did." And then I asked him, I said, "What is your understanding of what you're supposed to do in this trial?" And he looked at me and he grinned and he said, "I'm supposed to put it on Rejon." Rejon Taylor was the name of the defendant on trial.
Oh no.
And that was not what I was looking for, Kit. In our prep, I talked to him about, we went over the plea agreement and all the things the plea agreement had said, which was basically, I have to tell the truth. And, I'm hopeful that if I tell the truth, then the prosecution may recommend a sentence reduction for me. And, I understand that if I don't tell the truth, that it could get worse. Um, so, at first I thought, people, they react differently when they're in a public courtroom. And of course, this one was garnering a lot of attention because it's a death penalty case. The media's there, the courtroom's full. And sometimes people they don't react like you expect them to react on the stand. So I thought maybe it's just a product of, this was a guy from inner city Atlanta who wasn't terribly well educated, and I thought he might be intimidated by the surroundings. So I said, "Well, okay, what does that mean to you?" And he said, "Okay, yeah, so you brought me here and you put me in this chair 2 weeks ago," which was true. I did. I did a run through with him of his testimony 2 weeks earlier on the stand with a bunch of people in the audience so they could see how he testified, which I don't do very often, but this time I thought it was important. And he said, "So you put me up here in this chair 2 weeks ago and you told me to lie and say that Rejon did it, but he didn't." And I think that was
Oh my.
probably the most lonely feeling I've ever had. Certainly in my professional life, it was. Because now I've had a witness accuse me in public on the stand of telling him to lie and say that the defendant did it and he really didn't do it. And he was just sitting up there grinning the whole time. See, so I knew that I had missed something. And I went back to the table, and my colleague, his name's Chris Poole, great, great lawyer. And I went back to the table and I said, um, you got any ideas? Because I had a couple, but I didn't know which way I wanted to go with it. And he kind of looked up at me. He said, not really.
How do
And
you
I,
even recover from that? That's crazy.
yeah, yeah. I said, well, the way I see it, we have basically two options. I can either sit down and let the defense just wade into it at this point, or I can let him tell whatever story it is he's going to tell, and then, try to impeach my own witness when he's done. And he said, yeah, I think we should probably try to do that. And I said, okay, good. That was my inclination as well. So Chris and had been in the same fantasy football league for about 5 years leading up to that point. And I'm really proud of this, by the way. This is kind of a sidebar, but he always wanted me to trade him this great running back for San Diego named LaDainian Tomlinson, who I always had on my team, and I never would entertain those offers. And so right before I stood back up to address the witness again, I said to him, I said, I'll trade you LaDainian Tomlinson for your kicker if you take this witness. And he looked at me and he said, hell no. So I knew I was on my own. In the meantime, the FBI case agent who was sitting there next to me, I wrote him a note and I said, please go find out what's going on. So he took the note, he left the courtroom. And I stood back up and I said, all right, Mr. Matthews, why don't you just go ahead and tell the jury whatever story it is you're going to tell? And for the next 90 minutes, without stopping, he told a story that accounted for every single piece of evidence that I had, and it explained the defendant's innocence. And so um, it was fascinating. Like, the story was pretty wild, but it definitely took into account everything I had. And so, at the end of it, I had to turn around and impeach my own witness, which is never a good thing, right? But it's better than just letting it stand. So I talked about, I brought up the video interview he did with the police long before he ever met me, in which he told a story that was much more consistent with what I had expected him to tell on the stand. And then the FBI agent came back in and slid a note over to me, and it said, I just found out that the Hamilton County Jail put them in the same cell a year ago and never told us. So
Oh,
they had
no.
they had been concocting this. So they searched the cell. They found all of Rejohn's discovery materials that, we had given to his lawyer. They found all of that in Matthew's uh, stuff. And so they had been working on this in an effort to surprise us at trial
For
for a
a
year.
year.
Yeah. And in all those times where I prepped him, seemed like he was going to be a good witness. I mean, he was saying, the things I expected him to say, and, he wasn't very polished, of course, but, see, he was actually telling the truth in the sessions, but I missed that there was something else going on. I even asked him, I think one time, do you ever see, I knew they were in the jail together, but they were supposed to be separated. I said, do you ever see Rejon? He said, no. I see him like every once in a while across the, whatever, cross down the hall or something, but they have us separated, which they were supposed to. So I didn't even I challenge it or question it. And so then I took the note from the agent and I stood there and I asked him, I said, do you ever see Rejon in the jail? And he said, no. And I said, really? I said, tell me what cell he's in. And he said 6E. And I looked down at the piece of paper, which did not have anything written on it other than the note from Jim. So from the agent. So I didn't have anything specific on it. But I pretended like I did. And I said, uh-huh, that's right. And what cell are you in? And I looked back at him from the paper and he kind of leaned back and he grinned and he said, the same 6E or whatever it was, the same cell. And so, that's kind of how I ended the examination of him. And it ended up ironically, I think it ended up being great argument fodder for me because I was able to tell the jury that this isn't just somebody who killed someone, now 4 years ago. It's somebody who's still scheming to try to escape responsibility, and he got someone else to almost literally fall on his sword for him. That's how much influence he has. That's how dangerous he is because he can get anybody to do anything. And so that was part of my argument at closing, along with the fact that the defendant put a hit out on the other cooperating defendant that Chris Poole had done the examination of, the good one who stuck with, what he had been telling us, and showed remorse. The defendant put a hit out on him during the trial. And we intercepted some letters from him where he was talking to his girlfriend, telling his girlfriend they're acting like I killed the president or something. So, all those things kind of played into the argument ultimately, but I was really embarrassed because one of the things I think that I've always done very well as a prosecutor, and it's key to prosecution work, is preparation. And preparation involves prepping your witnesses and noticing when there's something off or something wrong, and then investigating it when you notice that there's something wrong or something off. And I just completely missed it. And it was really, really, really embarrassing, especially in front of the media and a packed courtroom.
What was the outcome of the trial?
They found him guilty and sentenced him to death. And then mm, whenever uh, President Biden was leaving office, he was one of the people on death row that the auto pen um, gave clemency to, and so he'll now just spend the rest of his life in prison.
Who
I
says Law
hope.
and Order isn't real? I'm just kidding. Obviously, it's, just a TV show, but that does sound remarkably like a made-for-TV movie, I'll tell you what.
It certainly has those elements for sure. I mean, I've had a lot of really interesting trials over my career. I'm able to tell stories about them all the time, and that's certainly one of them. And it was obviously one where the stakes couldn't have been higher. We're talking literally about life and death. So,
Right.
it was a
But
very
how did
important
that
case.
change your orientation in terms of your view of reality? What did you change about your process? Because if you would not have had the capacity, so I want to kind of back up and look at it here. If you did not have the capacity for healthy embarrassment, you would have changed nothing. And the next time you were in that position, you could have made an even bigger error that resulted in an innocent person being sentenced to death. So what did you change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a matter of maybe degree of care, um, in terms of how I approached it. Again, I would have said prior to that one of my greatest strengths is prepping witnesses and identifying when people are not telling me the truth or are telling me partial truths or what have you. I don't know exactly. Obviously, when you have evidence at your disposal to sort of test what people are saying, it helps. But I also have always just kind of had a knack for knowing when, yeah, that's just not ringing true to me, even if I didn't have evidence, to the contrary at my fingertips. So I decided that, it would be what I would do from then on out is be much more evidence-based rather than feel-based. And so, the feeling is the thing that gets me to pursue it more. But now I'm like, well, I can't just rely on the feeling. I've got to test everything that people say to me. And if I don't have corroboration for it, I'm going to dig for it. And one of the great things I think about being a federal prosecutor and prepping for cases is that you get the case agents, the law enforcement agents that have worked the cases, they work with you on the prep. I mean, that's part of their job. And so you can send them out and to get more information, go find out if this is true, or not, or if we can't find out if it's true or not. And then I have to make a determination. But, Obviously we had a lot of evidence of the defendant's guilt
Right.
outside of this cooperating co-defendant. I would never rely on a cooperating co-defendant as my proof that somebody was guilty of anything. I would never ask a jury to do it because I would never do it. Obviously, they have motivation to lie potentially if they think it's going to, if they think that, hey, if I say this, that'll help the prosecution, and then he'll ask the court to reduce my sentence. Um, so I think the other thing too is it's important to follow up. If they do lie, then you do make their lives more miserable. You charge them with obstruction or another crime, or you go into their sentencing and you tell the court, this person was supposed to be cooperating with me, and he lied. And so he should get a 2-point enhancement under the sentencing guidelines for obstruction, and get a larger sentence than what he was originally looking at. So it's important to do those things because it sends the message, don't screw around with the process. So I'm a big process guy. I mean, I think law is all about process, not results. If you have a sound process, then you're going to get the right results. And the vast majority of the time, or far more than you do if you come at it with a preconceived notion about what the result should be. To go back to your original question or one of your original questions, you don't start with the presumption that this thing is true. You actually take the event, the incident, the report, what have you, and you go out and you test it and find out if it's true. And then you just go where the evidence leads you.
Well, that kind of segues into another thing I kind of wanted to dip my toe in. What does accountability look like if you can't prosecute? If it's legally impossible, how do you hold somebody accountable?
You mean if we just don't have enough, we think somebody did something, but we don't have enough evidence?
Yeah, if you know that somebody is guilty and you can't prosecute them because whether it be the cops screwed something up in evidence collection, or I mean there's 100 different ways that your case can go wrong, correct?
Hmm. Hmm.
And if you get to a point where you say, listen, I know that this person is guilty and I don't have a viable route to convict them, how so they just go without accountability?
Yeah, they
How do
do.
you sit with that as a human?
Uh, I mean, you just you have to. Uh, that's the system. That's the process. And so,
How do you explain
depending
that to
on,
the victim, though?
yeah, it's hard. It's hard to explain it to the victim. It's not an easy process, but you have to try to make them understand that the law requires a process that requires us to prove someone's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and I don't have sufficient proof of it. And I wish I did. I believe he's guilty, but my belief that someone is guilty should never be enough to convict them. And so we have a process that we have to follow. And, I mean, I think depending on the reasons for why you can't get enough proof, like if there was some sort of police misconduct or there was law enforcement error, you try to, from an accountability standpoint, you try to correct that, right? You either get rid of the problem, or you train the problem. It doesn't solve the problem or the issue of the one person that got off free, but you know, we have a system that says this is how you got to do it, and people are presumed innocent until they're proven guilty, and you've got to overcome that burden. And so, kind of going back to my process versus results, uh, we live in a culture that says, it's better for one guilty person to go free than for 10 or 100, or depending on who you're talking to, what the quote is. uh be it's I think that maybe I'm getting this backwards, but we don't want to send innocent people to prison, right? um and so it's better for this, let me get it right. It's better for 10, 100 guilty people to go free than one innocent person go to prison. That's the quote. So but when I was in Georgia, the country of Georgia, for example, their culture is exactly the opposite. They would say, no, 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 it's better for, 10 innocent people to go to prison than for one guilty person to go free. And I don't think that's the right way to do things. So, they have a very results-based system, and there was a lot of injustice that was done as a result of that. So again, there's no such thing as a perfect system. You try to create a system that protects the innocent more. And sometimes when you take those steps to protect the innocent, it means guilty people are going to get away with things that they've done. And, we just have to understand and be willing to live with that as a society.
What is, because you're repeatedly encountering criminals, right? Like you talk to criminals, you talk about criminals all the time. Like that's literally your job. Does that make you personally better at recognizing wrongdoing, or does it make you, I guess, more suspicious? Do you have problems? I guess I'm asking about your emotional makeup. Do you have problems connecting with human beings? I literally just wrote about this last weekend because in my work I find that the correlation maybe is, or the correlation is there even if the causation isn't. How do you juxtapose those two things in your personal life?
Well, I think the first thing you have to realize, and I guess my faith kind of informs this quite a bit, is that I'm just as much of a sinner as the person I'm sitting across from, the defendant who committed a crime. I mean, my sins are maybe different. They're maybe carry far fewer earthly consequences than whatever sins they've committed in the process of committing a crime. But I'm not better than they are. I'm the same. I'm just the same as they are. And so I think so. First of all, it's important to come at it from that standpoint. It also humanizes the other person. They're not just a criminal; they're a person who committed criminal acts. Probably, I could count on maybe two hands. I used to say one hand. It might be two hands. The number of people that I prosecuted over the years that I thought were just evil. Most of the rest of them, and some of them are mean or angry or whatever, but most of the rest of them, they've made bad criminal judgments and decisions. And one bad decision often leads to another. And they're just not equipped for whatever reason to fix it and get themselves on the right path. So yeah, I'm the same as the person I'm sitting across from, but that also means that I'm skeptical of human nature. I don't, I'm a conservative Presbyterian boy, so I believe in the depravity of the human heart, and we're capable of great things, but we're also all of us are capable of bad and evil things as well, even if we're not evil in and of ourselves. So understanding that when you go into those conversations, I think helps from your own sort of emotional makeup and your own judgment. And I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question,
No, you
but
absolutely are. Do you think that having, I mean, I'm sure you've seen all manner of prosecutors and defense attorneys in your career, people who maybe have unmet emotional needs that they're bringing to the table, or people who have uh, identities that are fragile. And it sounds like what you're saying, I'm kind of extrapolating here, but you almost have to understand who you are and what your capability is for evil to properly approach the job with the right level of, I guess, the right mindset.
yeah, I mean, I say one of the things I say to juries when I do voir dire and we're picking the jury is, I ask them if anybody has any, moral, philosophical, ethical, reasons why they feel like they can't sit in judgment on another person's actions. And, I point out that we're not there asking them to judge whether the person is a bad person or to judge their hearts. That's God's job, not ours. We're human beings. We are called to judge other people's actions and to punish them if those actions violate the law or the rules or what have you. And I mean, every parent understands this, right? I mean, your kid, you come
Right.
home and the cookie jar's empty on its side and there's crumbs, and what do? You follow the crumb trail and then you interview suspects and witnesses, and then you make a determination of guilt and then you punish. I mean, it's just we do this and we're supposed to do it. But we live in a society and a culture now where people are so, I think, afraid of judging others or what they see as judging others. And I try to put them at ease about that because it's how I put myself at ease, which is it's not for me to say that this person that I'm sitting across from is a bad person or is evil or whatever. It's did they do the thing? If they did the thing, then a prosecution is righteous. And, ultimately it's the judge who decides the sentence, not me or not the jury. So, my job is to follow all the steps and make sure I'm doing everything the right way and present the evidence and then persuade, be an advocate, take the evidence and persuade other people to make a decision, make a judgment about that person's actions. So, um, I think that's kind of where you were going with that
Well, let's
question, but
look at, for instance, the Clancy case, because it's not as simple as did she do the thing?
hmm
Everybody's stipulating she did the thing, unless, of course, you're on the internet, but, we'll take that out of it. The question then becomes, and it's not even, is it okay that she did the thing? But I think that there's almost this tendency with some of these cases that as long as I can find a quote unquote understandable reason for why they did the thing, they shouldn't have to account for doing the thing. And
hmm
I think that that nuance is really dangerous.
Well, it is, and again, I think most of the argument, the sample argument that we referenced earlier that I posted, is about refuting her claim that she shouldn't be held accountable or responsible because of some mental defect. And of course, the prosecution has the obligation to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she did possess her faculties sufficient to be held accountable. That's a prosecutorial burden. It's a very difficult burden because, especially in a case like that, nobody, Kit, wants to believe that a mother would do that. There has to be some reason to explain it that does let her off the hook. Because if there isn't one, how do we live with that? How do we live with people who would strangle the life out of their three little helpless children? It's hard to live in that world. And so people are grasping for any explanation that will help them wrap their minds around it. They don't want to believe it's true. And that makes the job of a prosecutor very difficult, because you know that the people sitting on the jury, no matter who they are kind of like, come on, man. I mean, you know, no no sane mother would ever do that.
But look
Um,
back at the Diane Downs case from, what, 20 something years ago. She shot her children because of, I don't know if you're familiar with the case. It was,
I kind of vaguely
um,
remember the name, but I can't tell you that I remember
she
the
had a
specific.
boyfriend who said he didn't want children.
Ah, yeah. Okay. Yep.
And I I don't think at that time, I don't remember clearly, but I don't think at that time that the average person was saying, "Oh, well, I understand it. She probably shouldn't be held accountable." No, people were like, "Friar," because we understood that that wasn't like that there is no quote unquote good reason.
Right.
And what does it say about society? And maybe we're getting into an entirely different discussion here, but that the cultural expectations or the cultural ideas, I guess, have changed so much that the default is, well, there must be, like you say, there must be a reason because this is so beyond the pale that there's got to be a mitigating circumstance somewhere. Well, what if there isn't?
Yeah. So I would differentiate those two cases in this way. The the case you mentioned, as I recall, that's what the explanation was at the time. Her boyfriend
Mhm.
didn't want kids. I don't remember that she posited a postpartum
No, she didn't.
psychosis type of defense. She basically said, "Well, this is why I did it," and everybody understands that's an unacceptable. That's that's not a legally justifiable excuse for not holding you accountable, right? If you're insane, we've always recognized that as a thing. Like if you're insane, then you can't be held accountable in the same way anyway as you are if you're not insane. I've faced many mental defect defenses in the course of my career. I find most of them to be contrived and unpersuasive and created or concocted after the fact. Um, but but there are examples of times, certainly when people have, for whatever reason, they've lost their minds and done something horrible. Um, and so, being able to parse through that is important. To give you another example, when I was in the Army, I prosecuted a woman who killed her husband. They were both Army sergeants. She stabbed him over 125 times. The tip of the blade broke off in his skull. And then she sat down in the middle of the street with his head in her lap and almost cut off his head at like 3 in the morning. Then she got up, looked both ways, went to her apartment, put all the clothes in the washing machine, changed her clothes, and went and hid. The police found her, I don't know, but hiding about a quarter of a mile away. She had deposited various pieces of evidence. She tried to hide them along the way that was found later. Um, it was a horrific, horrific crime. At one point, I had a witness who woke up and she saw the two of them standing about 10 feet apart on the road next to his truck, and he had already been stabbed. She cut his throat from behind when he went to check the tire on his car, which she had stabbed. Um, and he was kind of falling down and getting up and saying, "No, no, no." And she said to him, "Shut up, Terry. Nobody's going to help you." And then he tried to get away from her, and she walked after him and shoved him down from behind and started stabbing him in the head and the neck. It's just a horrible, horrible crime. And then after they caught her, they were doing the interview in the police. It was a videotaped interview, and the police officer during the course of the interview advised her that her husband had died, and she went into hysterics. She started crying, "No, no, 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 not what happened? No, no, no." And the police officer got up and left the room to go get Kleenex for her and came back before he came back, the video showed her, she stopped crying immediately. She reached across the table, grabbed his notebook. He had left his notebook behind. She licked her finger, turned the pages, turned to the third page where the description of the suspect was that said that the attacker appeared to have long hair with a ponytail. She took the ponytail out of her hair and fluffed her hair up, and then she turned the notebook back and slid it back over in front of him, or back where he had left it, so it was in front of him when he got back. Then, when he started questioning her some more, she started rocking back and forth and singing "I'm a Little Teapot." I watched this and I'm like, I knew there was something about the "I'm a Little Teapot" thing. I couldn't remember what it was. It was something that was in my recent memory. And so I started asking around, and somebody told me, yeah, there was a Stephen King movie that aired on TV not a month ago, and it was about this virus that passed from person to person that caused them to kill. And then once they had done the killing, the virus moved on to another person, and they would stay behind and they would sing "I'm a Little Teapot." So the whole thing, it was all contrived. And she goes to trial and she claims that she's a battered spouse and that she snapped because she's a battered spouse. That was her defense, and she got a psychologist to come in and say that. Um, but there was no real actual evidence of her being a battered spouse, and in fact, probably to the contrary. And when we cross-examined the psychologist had just done a poor job, although she was very well known. But she was kind of a psychologist for hire on this battered women syndrome thing, and whenever she could get herself out there, she would get out there, and so it. But I had dealt with that same kind of scenario where I charged her with premeditated first degree murder, but the nature of the crime kind of seemed to, in a knee-jerk way, run counter to a theory of premeditation. It did look like she snapped just because of the savagery of the attack. And so I had to overcome that. And I was in front of a military jury. It was a court martial, a general court martial with, officers and non-commissioned officers on the jury. But, I mean, even in the military, you look at that and you're like, oh my gosh, she must have just snapped because she was not very big. He was bigger than she was. And so, but I had a theory as to what the motive was that I thought was pretty good. And we presented that theory and kind of like what I did with the mock argument for the Clancy case, I tried to very systematically go through each step of the process of killing and say, you know, is she in possession of her faculties? Could she have stopped? How do we know she could have stopped? She could have stopped because she did this and she did this and she did this. She did all these things that flew in the face of somebody who just, went off the handle in an uncontrollable rage because she snapped. And so, it's the prosecutor's burden to overcome those sort of instincts that we as human beings have, though, that say, well, that can't be true. I mean, she can't have been in possession of her faculties and done something like that, right? The father of her two 10-month-old twins. But she very much did. And one of those evil people that I said, probably on two hands I could count them that I prosecuted, she would definitely be one of them.
What crosses the line? Like, how do you determine this person is genuinely evil from this person is just making such beyond poor choices that they have found themselves in front of me?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously part of it is the conduct. I remember in trial with her, they put her on the stand and she started testifying and she laughed about her glamour shot pictures. It just was, I don't know, Kit. It's just like I don't, it's hard to explain, but you know it when you see it.
Where your
Um,
soul recognizes it almost.
It, yeah,
I know what you're
yeah,
talking about.
yeah. It's like, I can't believe it. Going back to the other case I mentioned, the death penalty case, I actually met with him for 6 hours. His lawyers wanted me to meet with him because they were trying to talk him into pleading guilty and having us take the death penalty off the table. So I met with him for 6 hours, and he came in with a cross around his neck and a Bible in his hand. And so I spent hours talking to him about, I said, well, let me talk to you first, prosecutor to defendant. This is the evidence that we have. You're going to get convicted. The only question is going to be whether you're going to be sentenced to death or spend the rest of your life in prison. I don't want you to be sentenced to death. I want you to, the evidence is strong. You should take advantage of the opportunity to have the death penalty taken off the table. And then I said, I know she brought a Bible and you're wearing a cross. Are you a believer? And he said, oh, yes, sir, I am. And I said, okay, well, then let me talk to you, Christian to profess Christian. I went kind of through theology 101 about, forgiveness and repentance. And I said, scripture talks about how when we've wronged our brother, we should leave our sacrifice at the altar and go make things right with our brother, right? That's part of repentance. And here you have this opportunity because you've hurt the people that love this man that you've killed. You can give them some closure. You can help prevent them from having to see things in the trial that no loved one should have to see. The autopsy pictures and the crime scene pictures and, all those things. And you can own what you did and plead guilty. And, that's the Christian thing to do. And I said to him, I said, Rejon, I hope one day you and I can hug each other in heaven as fellow believers in Christ. But I said, when you do something like this, you have to you have to pay the consequences. And I referenced, Romans 13 about how the government does not bear the sword for nothing for wrongdoers, which is actually an endorsement of capital punishment, by the way, in the New Testament. And so, I went through all that with him, and he was nodding his head like the whole time, leaned forward, nodding his head. And then he looks around the room, and it was nothing but men in the room. He had four lawyers, and then we had, I think, four FBI agents and two prosecutors sitting in the room, all men. And he looks around the room, he nods his head, and he said, You know, I think what Mr. Neff had to say is very interesting. What do you gentlemen think? And right then I knew what I was dealing with. And he's a sociopath. Like he's evil. It's just he's evil. Um, and that made it easier for me, honestly, to argue for the death penalty because I knew what he was.
Yeah.
And so, it's just one of those things that you just kind of you ask what the line is. I don't know. I don't know how to articulate what the line is. It's just sort of, remember the Supreme Court justice that said, I can't really define pornography, but I know it when I see it.
Right.
That's what this is. I can't really define where the line between just mean and angry is versus evil, but I know it when it's crossed.
Well, that kind of my last question for you that I'd set aside was you talk openly about your faith, about being not just a prosecutor, but a Christian prosecutor. How do you reconcile justice with mercy, with punishment, with human fallibility? But I think you've pretty much answered that.
Yeah, I often said that I saw my job as both a Romans 13 and a Micah 6:8 mission. And, Micah 6:8 specifically invokes mercy. The law is what the law is. The sentences are what they are. I don't decide sentences, of course. But there are lots of ways that I think, as a prosecutor with prosecutorial discretion and power, there are times when I've not prosecuted somebody, even though I could have, um, because I thought that would not be the appropriate result. I may refer it back to the state for the state to prosecute and have them get a much lower sentence or, what have you. Um, and there are times when I learn about a defendant's background and I learn more about what brought them to the place there, it may alter my argument at sentencing for what they should get. I think the vast majority of the cases that I argued at sentencings for, because federal sentencing is its own sort of trial and litigation, because there are different things that the sentencing guidelines can different ways it can be applied to enhance or reduce sentences. And so, when I would learn something about a defendant that I thought mitigated his guilt or the level of responsibility to which he should be held, most of the time I would argue for a sentence at the bottom end of the sentencing guidelines. Sometimes I even argued for sentences that were below the sentencing guidelines for various reasons. Um, I did that far more than I did the other way, like far more than I said, no, they should get a sentence higher than what the guidelines say. So, I mean, there's lots of ways that mercy can be dispensed. And, I pray for every defendant that I've ever prosecuted, I've prayed for. Um, and I trust that God is going to kind of lead me in the way that he wants me to go because he is a God of justice and he's also a God of mercy. And if I'm trying to do his will, then hopefully I'm threading that needle the right way.
Love it. I love everything that you just said. Last question I'll give you. Have you ever won a case and yet felt as though justice wasn't actually done?
And can you be specific, like in what way? Like um, that the person was not held accountable enough, or the person was held accountable beyond what they should have been held
Yeah.
accountable? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure I know there's times where people were not held accountable enough that I can think of. And that was simply a proof issue, right? Like it was sort of what our conversation was earlier on. I know you're guilty. I know you did these other things too, but I can't really address those other things. I can only address this. And it may be, something, a consequence that's far lower than what they should. I've prosecuted people we strongly suspect murdered somebody, and I prosecuted them for having a gun, being a felon
Mm.
and having a gun. It's not, murder is not generally a federal case unless there are specific things that are met. It's usually a state case. So there's not really much I can do about just a garden variety state murder case. But, we try to do the best we can with the tools at our disposal. And if we can make a case that a felon had a gun, even if we're pretty sure that he killed somebody, but the state can't make the case, well, then maybe he gets the 5 or 8 years in federal prison, which is better than 0 years, but probably doesn't do justice to what his conduct actually was. So there's examples of those. I think there's probably there's a number of examples where we would come back from court and the judge, of course, again, it's the judge who sentences them, not us. And the judge maybe gave them a sentence higher than what we thought he should. And it happens a lot, I think, in drug cases. There are pretty tough mandatory minimums and pretty tough sentencing guidelines in federal drug cases. And, even if we argued, hey, judge, it's probably a bottom of the guidelines case, if the judge for some reason thought otherwise, and gave him a top of the guidelines or above guidelines sentence, we might walk back and say, that was too much time. So, there are examples of both of those things, but I like to say that justice is a window. There's no one right result most of the time that satisfies justice. I think the goal is to try to stay within the window. And you could be on the lower left-hand side of the window, or you could be on the upper right-hand side of the window, and different people might have different opinions about, where in the window you should be. But as long as you're in the window of justice, you've done your job.
Fair enough. Well, hey, thank you very much for this. This has been, I could talk to you all day, but
Sure, I'm happy to do it anytime.
the lesson from this episode is orientation based. What do you do when reality changes in front of you? When you're faced with evidence that your model was wrong? Can you adapt? Can you allow yourself to be embarrassed without collapsing into shame? After all, shame paralyzes us. Embarrassment can drive appropriate change. Deception often lines up with what we already think and merely pulls us further down a road we already want to be on. Steve's courtroom experience shows what adaptation looks like and how we can still have a good outcome even when things go wrong, if we are willing to reorient and deal with the reality in front of us instead of hanging on to the reality we want to believe. Dig for the evidence and be willing to follow it. This has been Change the Game.